As a seminarian, one of my favorite things to do was to visit Miss Goche's middle school classroom. She taught religion, and every August I'd give a presentation to her students on vocations. Early on in the presentation, I'd ask her students about the difference between discovery and invention. Did Columbus discover America, or did he invent it? He discovered it, they'd say. And eventually we'd get around to the fact that to invent something is to create something that wasn't there in the first place. To discover something is to find something that someone else created. I thought of my visits to Miss Goche's classroom in light of our second reading. Pass the time of your exile in reverence. Reverence. What does it mean? Well, rather than inventing reality for myself, rather than determining reality or my life, discovering reality. Receiving reality, receiving history as God's gift. I don't invent myself, my life, or history, but rather discover them. Receive them as something created, not by me, but by someone else. St. Peter's words are particularly appropriate for us in the 21st century, for us in this time of quarantine. So often today we have an attitude of invention. My life is mine to invent, to determine. There's nothing given about it. Rather, it's mine to shape and mold as I choose. During this time of quarantine, rather than receiving God's providence, insisting that it be something else, something different. If you find yourself kicking against God's will for creation, kicking against God's providence, take a breath. Our readings today have one more word for us. Be reverent is the first. The second, take your time. It takes time to be reverent. God gives us time to be reverent. Let's dig more deeply into today's readings to discover God's timely message of reverence. God gives us time. Time, time, time. We see it all over our readings today, all over the Easter season. If we think back to Easter Sunday, we see the time that God gave Mary Magdalene to recognize him for who he is. On the first day of the week, she goes to the tomb and sees the stone removed. She tells Peter and John. She returns with them, they leave, she stays. While she's there, she sees angels, converses with them. Jesus appears, she doesn't recognize him at first, but when he calls her by name, she exclaims, Rabbi. It took a whole morning for Mary to see God as he is, to be reverent. Easter Sunday night, Christ appears to the apostles. It takes them time to recognize him. Thomas isn't there. Initially, he disbelieves. God gives him a whole week. Then he appears and Thomas declares, my Lord and my God. Today's first reading, Peter seems to have it all together. He now realizes that Christ was delivered up by the set plan and foreknowledge of God. He now sees that David in Psalm 16 is speaking of the Christ. We forget that this sermon of Peter occurs on the 50th day after the resurrection. Peter's sermon is the fruit of 50 days of reflection. Our gospel. The disciples conversing among themselves about Jesus and his fate. They think him defeated. Jesus draws near. Together they walk 60 stadia, 7 miles. It's only at the end of that long journey that they recognize the Lord, that they become aware of the fire burning in their hearts. Time, time, time. God gives us time. As we read in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, God communicates himself to man gradually. He prepares him to welcome him by stages. For what purpose does he give us that time? Reverence. In particular, reverence toward two things: toward creation and providence, toward what he has made, toward what he does in time and history. Let's look at creation again. We did not invent creation. God did. We did not invent ourselves. God did. And so our life is not a life of self-determination, but rather one of discovery, of reverence. This has huge consequences for us, huge consequences for our young people. There is a divine givenness to who we are. Just like we can't make 2, 3, we cannot invent ourselves. Our vocation, whether it be marriage, holy orders, consecrated life, is a discovery that we surrender to, rather than an invention that we determine. The divine givenness of creation, the divine givenness of providence. Not only do we discover who we are, what we're called to, we also discover God's action in history. All history is either directly willed by God or permitted by him. There are no accidents. And so we can look at the course of our lives, what happens and what doesn't happen, and we can insist that this be that and that be this, or we can strive to discover and to surrender to the divine meaning and purpose of history. It takes time to be reverent. God gives us time to be reverent. What does this mean for us? First, don't be too hard on yourself. In the early days of quarantine, I was visiting a family that I'm close to. Mom was describing her struggles. I shared with her these words: "No one does pandemic well the first time." This is a 100-year event, a once-in-a-lifetime event. Don't be too hard on yourself. It took Mary a morning, the apostles a day, Thomas a week, Peter 7 weeks, and the disciples on the road to Emmaus 60 stadia. No one does pandemic well the first time. Second, cultivate an attitude of wonder, of discovery. Rather than trying to make yourself into something else, rather than dwelling on what you're not or what you think you should be, discover the person whom God has created. Discover the vocation which God has given. Rather than insisting that this time be something that it isn't, discover this time's divine meaning and purpose. Be reverent. Take your time. Sometimes we feel like we're on the clock. If I don't get this right now, I never will. Sometimes we feel like God has us on a clock. He doesn't. He communicates himself to us gradually. He prepares us to welcome him by stages. Imagine a community, a parish, where men and women reverence their God-given identities, rather than spinning their wheels in self-determination. Where men and women reverence the God-given identities of others. Where men and women reverence what God is doing, rather than dwelling on what he's not. I fondly remember my visits to Miss Gautier's classroom. where I discovered more fully the difference between discovery and invention. August after August, I gave that same presentation, and with time, discovered the meaning of St. Peter's words. Pass the time of your exile in reverence.